Hello everyone, more Old Testament and we're still in Genesis chapter 30. In the last segment I spoke about the story of the child Cold War or the child nuclear war or whatever you want to call it, of Leah, Rachel, Zilpah, and Bella all involved in having children for Jacob to win Jacob's favor. And Jacob loved Rachel. That's it. Rachel was his favorite, and I'll talk about that later. That there is a part in the meeting between him and Esau in that scenario that shows how much he loved them and their status with him. Anyway, but now let's get back to Laban. Laban, his name means white. Laban, white like milk. Laban means milk, yogurt, milk products basically, but in Hebrew it's white. And his name is also interesting because in Hebrew heart is live, Lavan, live. So heart and white, and this will come in later. But Laban, is a money grubbing uncle. He tried to keep Rebecca from going to Isaac after he saw all the gold in her, but Eliezer of Damascus was savvy. Rebecca chose to go with him. That trick didn't work, but he's managed to keep Jacob with him for 14, 15 years so far, and he's taken like all of Jacob's work, and I think that was Jacob's school of hard knocks. He's been tricked. He tricked Esau of his birthright, of his barakah and bakura, of his birthright and his blessings. And I wouldn't say tricked. I think it was meant to be, but Jacob was a willing partner in hastening getting the blessing. I remember a lesson that an institute teacher of mine taught me 25 years ago, and it was sort of a revelation to me, and it was something that stuck with me from those institute classes, one of many things. But the instructor said, if Adam and Eve just waited in the garden, obeyed Heavenly Father, and didn't partake of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, Heavenly Father would have eventually allowed them to come to earth and have children and go on with the plan of salvation. And I know this is not doctrinal, but it made sense to me. I think if they chose to obey, there would have been a way. And I think that's the lesson I've been learning so far this year. It's not learning even, it's been re-emphasized in my mind this year that you should wait for Heavenly Father. You should wait for His own timing for things to happen. You shouldn't try to hasten. Even if you have a blessing, even if you're told you will have this blessing, you shouldn't rely on the arm of the flesh to make it happen. In one way, you can be righteous, you obey the commandments, you follow Him, but you do not compromise your moral standards in order to make a blessing happen. And I think this is what's happening to Jacob here. This exile with Laban, it was meant to be just for a few months until Esau's boiling of blood eased up a bit, and until he could come back, and he ended up staying for close to 20 years with Laban, being abused and tricked at every turn in the marriage, in his earnings. He's living a life of poverty with, or under the, not poverty, under the wing of Laban, basically taking his living from Laban, working for Laban, and Laban is the one who decides his living. Um, so I think those were years of growth, those were years of learning and wisdom. There are still more lessons for him to learn. I think, and I said this a couple of segments ago, I think his relationship with Leah was bad because Leah's birthright, Leah's bakura, her being the oldest, was enforced on him in the sense that he had to marry her in order to get Rachel. So I think that always reminded him of what he did to Esau, always reminded him of his guilt, and I think he always struggled with that. So now Jacob has most of his sons. He has 11 of them. And when Joseph is born, Jacob says to Laban, "Let me go." Now notice, "let me go." This is the same thing that the same phrase that Moses later on will use with the Pharaoh. Will use with Pharaoh. "Let me go," to Laban. "Let me go back to my place, to my country. Give me my children, give me my wives, for whom I've served you, and you know the service I've served you with." So he's asking for permission to leave, and that is customary. Laban is the head of the family, the head of the tribe, maybe. He's a person of authority. He needs to allow this to happen. He needs to give the word for you to leave, especially that you have his daughters. And Laban acknowledged this, and there is this exchange between them about how Laban has been blessed because of Jacob, because of Jacob's service. And Jacob is saying, "I want to be able to support my own family before I leave, so I need you to pay me for them." And Jacob basically says, give me your sheep, and I'll go take care of it. And whatever is born of the sheep that it has blemishes or is kind of not black but sort of grayish, these are colors that are not good with sheep. At least in the Near Eastern mind, you don't want to have these sheep. There is an interesting story in the Quran that emphasizes this in Judaism, that the Jews required their sheep to be without blemish, and so, a sheep with blemishes or coloration isn't considered good sheep. But Jacob says, I'll take sheep, and when they give birth, you take the Laban ones, you take the white ones, so that's similar to Laban's name, and I will take the ones that are with blemishes and colors. Sounds to Laban probably like an amazing deal, because sheep usually are not inclined to give birth to sheep with blemishes. So he agrees. He agrees, and he says anything that you find with me that is not with blemish is considered stolen. So this is a way to separate their two cattle. And Laban says, "Go ahead," thinking that this is a good deal and he will trick Jacob again, and Jacob will have to stay with him for decades and decades to earn enough sheep to get his pay, to get enough money to be able to support himself, or to get enough cattle to support herself. But Jacob goes and has a 3 days distance between their cattle, and he starts taking care of the sheep, and he uses certain tree stems, and he cuts them in a certain way, and he puts it in the water, and basically when the sheep come in, they will see the colors, and the colors of those sticks, and they will give birth to sheep that have those same colors. Now, we know from modern, and I checked that the other day again just to make sure that I'm not saying nonsense here. There are ways you can control sheep birth, and with hormones and all of that stuff, you can have them give birth several times a year, because sheep, if left alone, usually they give birth sometime in the fall. But in Middle Eastern cultures, sometimes you can get them to give birth again in the spring. So they can give two births a year, but the customary is they give one birth a year, and that's usually in the fall. So Jacob here, and this is an important detail that I'll come back to in a few seconds here. Jacob here plays a trick of some sort in the sheep, and we don't know the origin of this trick or how it worked. But he gets the white sheep for Laban, and then he gets the dotted, blotted sheep, dotted, dark, blemished sheep as well. Now, in all the translations that I've read, nobody makes this distinction, but in this very old translation of the Torah by Saadia Gaon, he calls them spring sheep and fall sheep, and that's where that distinction is important. Why is this distinction important? Now, this is another story that is a source of conflict for Jewish rabbis when they read it, and because again, Jacob is this idealized, honest person. He is a Sadiq. He is the father of the nation of Israel. And you can't ascribe to him trickery. You can't say he's a trickster. You can't say he cheated. So how do they explain this? How can you teach your children to be honest and in their business dealings when you are talking about Avinu Yaakov, our father Jacob, doing this? And this is the spring and the spring and thing with the sheep is how they explain it. They say the spring and the fall sheep. So they say, well, Jacob took care of the sheep, and he gave Laban what Laban was expecting, which is the sheep in the spring, in the fall. Now, the sheep that were born with the blemishes were born in the spring, so those were like the cream on the top, and those were not things that Laban was even expecting to have. And so there was no cheating here. Jacob gave Laban exactly what he promised him, and he used this trick to have the sheep bear children again, bear sheep in the spring, and so he got the things that Laban wasn't expecting. And as to the trick with the sticks, you can tell from the name of the trees that are mentioned here. These are not fall trees in the Middle East. These are spring trees. So that supports the Gaon interpretation of it being spring sheep and fall sheep. But I think it's a very clever way of explaining this part of the story of Jacob. And Jacob becomes extremely blessed, and he has lots of sheep, and with that wealth he acquires lots of slave women, slave men, lots of camels. Notice it mentions camels and donkeys. Camels in that part of Mesopotamia were still a new thing. Owning camels was a big deal around 1400, I believe, BC. At least that's what the archaeologists and people who study that era tell us. Having camels was a big deal. Having donkeys was a big deal. So he has this massive fortune, which in chapter 31 starts this envy among the sons of Laban, who now say Jacob stole from us. Jacob became rich on our backs. And there is this interesting phrase here about Jacob seeing the face of Laban. Jacob seeing the face of Laban. And the seeing the face here is sort of a theme that will repeat in this chapter, and the repeat within the story of Esau when Jacob sees Esau. And I'll talk about it when I get to it. And the Lord in verse 3 tells Jacob, go back now, you're ready to go back to the land of your fathers. And Jacob consults with his wives, with Rachel and Leah, and he tells them the story of the sheep, that he hasn't stolen, that he hasn't tricked, that this is his right inheritance, his right pay, not inheritance, pay, for all the service. And Rachel and Leah agree with him. They say, yeah, our father, he had you work all of these years. He ate, he spent everything that he earned for the pay you gave him for us, all of these years of work. So yeah, let's get back, let's get out of here. And I think it's normal human nature. You want independence from your parents. Laban, as a tribal leader, as a rich tribal leader, probably had lots of influence and lots of control over his children. And the Lord tells in sleep, in a dream, he tells Jacob, he calls Jacob's name. An angel of the Lord calls Jacob's name, and Jacob answers like Abraham answered, Labbaik, Heno, I'm here, Haini, I'm here. He gives that answer that I really love, Labbaik. And remember, I talked about that a few segments ago. It's a call when the Muslims go and to Hajj every year. This is the call that they give while they go around the ancient shrine, what they believe is the ancient shrine of Abraham and Ishmael, and they say Labbaik Allahumma Labbaik. They Hayni Hayina Hineo. They repeat that phrase. It's a beautiful phrase. It shows readiness. I'm listening. I'm doing it. I'm gonna go. I'm gonna obey. Labbaik. There is no translation for it in English, unfortunately, that reflects the majesty of it and the richness of it. At least to this Arab-speaking person, it is a word that evokes lots of feelings. So the Lord tells him about the angel of the Lord tells him about this, and he reminds him that he needs to go to Beth El, the house of God, the house of Elohim, because that's where he made the promise. That's where he erected that stone, and he says, "Go back to the country of your birth." And Jacob just makes a run for it, and while Laban was away. So this is again sort of a strategy. I wouldn't use the word trick. This is a strategy. He doesn't tell his father-in-law that he's leaving, which is a big no-no in tribal cultures. It's very impolite, and he runs and. But then the angel of the Lord does this. So Laban chases him, but the angel of the Lord appears to him and he says to Laban, be careful. You are not going to say one bad word to Jacob because I am with him. And Laban finally sees Jacob and he says, why did you leave like this? I would have let you leave. Why did you leave like a thief in the night? Why did you take my daughters like they are some more prize? Why did you do this? This is a scandal. Why didn't you let me kiss my daughters goodbye? Because in those days, once the daughters left, they are not going to see the. It's like basically they died because you're never going to see them again. And so it is kind of sad for Laban, but you understand why Jacob had to do it this way. And he tells him that what the angel of the Lord told him, but he says, why did you steal my idols? Now here is this big story about stealing the idols. Beloved Rachel, Jacob's beloved Rachel takes the idol, and Jacob doesn't know anything about it, and of course Laban first suspects Bella and Zilpah, so he goes in to check in their tents, kind of racism in a way that we have reflected. You first suspect the house help, the servants, and but he couldn't find anything. He searched Leah, he didn't find anything. Then he goes to Rachel, and Rachel was the one who took it. She but she put it in the seat in the saddle that you put in a camel. Now, I don't know if you've ever ridden a camel, but that saddle is massive and there is lots of room to hide things, and that's under it. So she has put the idol in the saddle and sat on it, and then she says, "Oh, it's that time of the month. I can't stand up. The idol is sitting under her." Now, you might think, how is this mother of Israel worshiping idols? Now, in the story, remember, so far in the book of Genesis, listen carefully to this one. The Lord doesn't say at all that I am the only God. I can be wrong, but he hasn't said it so far. He's just making covenants that you worship me. Now, what's going on in here? Now, here is where I want you to distinguish between different things. There is monotheism, and there is idolatry, and there is something called monolatry, like idolatry, worship of idols, and then there is monolatry, which is the worship of one God. So you'd say, what's the difference between monotheism and monolatry? And I know what idolatry is, but monolatry is about the worship of one God, and monotheism is about the worship of one God. Well, the worship monolatry is where you recognize all of these other gods, but your household has adopted. And again, the second or third segment in this series, I spoke about the ancient culture of the Near East, and I spoke about the idol worship. Monolatry is where you worship one God, is where your household adopts one God, but you recognize that there are other gods. And you even can have certain attachments to them, but you can't worship them because you've adopted this one God. And in the case of the house of Jacob, they adopted the worship of Jehovah. Now, monotheism is where you say, nope, Jehovah is my God, Yahweh is my God, everyone else is the figment of imagination in the minds of the people who worship them. So this is what this story is about. The Lord, Yahweh, Jehovah, has not said yet, I am the only God. This is not going to happen until we get to Horeb, until we get to Moses and Sinai. So far, he is the God of covenant. So I think that's where Rachel can be justified, not justified, but where you can understand why she would take the household God. And Jacob, so far in the story, he has this covenant with Yahweh, but I don't know, it doesn't tell you how committed he was. Like, was he worshiping? Was he believing in other gods? We don't know, because there was the pantheon of the Near East, especially in that area, was just lots of gods, and I'll talk about this in a different segment when we get to the worship of different gods, when we get to Moses. So, and so poor Laban, he's right, but Jacob is furious at him. How dare you? And verse 32, Jacob tells Laban, if you find this with anyone, then with anyone of my household, that person will die. That person will die. And the Jewish rabbis talk about this, and they say that's the reason that Rachel died early. This is the reason why she left him, because he made that promise, and Rachel had to die because he said whoever stole it will die, and that was her punishment, that she died early. So again, you get the sense that Rachel and Jacob had similar personality traits. They were kind of rebels. They didn't believe in rules. They would act in improper ways, justify it, twist the truth, and that sort of thing. Again, Jewish rabbis, I'm sure, will always find a story to absolve them from that imperfection. Um, so So they make a covenant. And again, remember when we talked about covenants, this probably falls under parity covenants, because now Jacob is a very rich guy, Laban is a very rich guy, and they make a parity covenant between each other. They call the place call the place Gilead, and because it is a witness between them. That's Gilad. This is what the words mean. And then this verse 49 shows you the tenderness of Laban. This is where you sort of like him, where he says, I want to make sure that you will not mistreat my daughters, because remember, his daughters are leaving forever. And this is a memorial to testify to that. And they slaughter, remember the covenant, something has to be cut, a berit, and they cut, they slaughter animals, they eat it, and they sleep in the mountain. And Jacob heads on finally to the land of his fathers, where he will meet Esau, and that's the subject of the next segment. Thank you for listening.